He called her at 2:17 a.m. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he never could the night before a mission. It was the same routine, one he'd repeated every deployment for nearly 3 years. No matter where he was stationed, no matter the time zone, Marcus always called home before sunrise. And every time, his mother answered. Sometimes she'd scold him. "Marcus, do you know what time it is?" Sometimes she'd laugh and tell him he sounded tired. But every time, she'd pick up. That was their unspoken promise. That night, her voice was soft, heavy with sleep. He could hear the clock ticking in her kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of home, a world away from his own. He smiled when she said his name. It reminded him that someone still saw him as more than a uniform. She asked if he was okay. He told her he was fine. He always did. But there was something in his tone this time, something quieter. Each pause between his words seemed to hold its own weight. He wasn't afraid, but he sounded distant, like he was already halfway gone. She told him she'd made his favorite stew that evening, and that the dog still waited by the front door every night. He chuckled softly, said he missed that old mutt more than anything. Then silence, long, heavy silence. She thought the call had dropped, but it hadn't. He was just listening, maybe to her breathing, maybe to the faint sound of normal life through the phone. He whispered, almost to himself, "You still leave the porch light on?" She said she never turned it off. He exhaled slowly and said, "Good." He told her the mission would be short, routine. He said he'd be home soon, and she believed him because she wanted to. He laughed once more before hanging up, that same easy laugh she'd known since he was a boy. She told him to stay safe. He told her not to worry. And then the call ended with a small click, a sound she would never forget. For a moment, she stood there, phone still in her hand, staring at the dark window by the sink. Something inside her wouldn't let her go back to sleep. She didn't know why, but she stayed there, listening, waiting, as if the silence itself might tell her something. Somewhere on the other side of the world, Marcus sat in his tent, gear packed, rifle across his lap, his mother's voice still echoing in his head. The camp was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before something you can't see. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo of his mother, his sister, and the dog, the porch light glowing behind them. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He slipped the photo into his vest, close to his heart. That was the last time he would hear her voice, the last ordinary thing before the world changed, before the valley, before the radio went dead. At 2:17 a.m., a mother heard her son say goodnight. By 7:42, his unit would be on the move. And before the sun touched the horizon, that call, that simple, ordinary call, would become the final echo of a promise never kept. Some stories begin with a battle. This one began with a phone call, a voice in the dark, and a son who said, "Don't stay up for me, Mom. I'll be home soon." He was 26 years old, but the lines around his eyes belonged to someone twice that age. 9 months into deployment, and Marcus had stopped counting days. The calendar meant nothing out there, only the routine. Wake, gear up, patrol, return, repeat. His world was a square of desert wrapped in wire and silence. The air smelled of dust and diesel. The sun rose hard and left harder. Coffee cooled before it could be finished. Letters from home came creased and faded, carrying the scent of another life. At night, the wind pushed sand under the doors and the sky looked too wide to be trusted. He shared that outpost with 12 men, a small team that had become the closest thing to the family he had left. Sergeant Raines was the oldest, gray at the temples, voice like gravel. He'd been in long enough to stop pretending the war would end soon. The others called him Dad, half joking, half true. Ortiz was the youngest, barely 20, still kept a folded picture of his high school sweetheart in his helmet. He tried to act fearless, but his hands always trembled before a patrol. Daniels, the joker, never ran out of stories or one-liners. When the tension built too high, he could make a whole tent laugh just by cursing at the sandstorms. Marcus was somewhere between them all, steady, careful, the one everyone turned to when things went quiet. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. When the day was done, after the checks and briefings, he would sit by the same cracked radio and call home. That was his ritual, his anchor. He'd lean back in the wooden chair, the desert wind pushing through the tent flaps, and wait for his mother's voice. Sometimes she'd answer on the first ring, sometimes on the third, always with that same sleepy concern. "Marcus, you're up again." He'd smile, though she couldn't see it. "Just wanted to hear your voice, Mom." They'd talk about nothing and everything. The weather back home, the dog's bad habits, his sister's new job. It grounded him, those small details of a world untouched by war. And every time, before they hung up, she'd say the same words. "You promise me, Marcus, you will come home safe." And he'd always give the same quiet answer. "Always, Mom." When the call ended, he would stare at the photo taped to his gear, his mother, standing on the porch, the light glowing behind her. It was a reminder of where he came from and what waited if he made it back. Outside the tent, the camp moved in its tired rhythm. Someone cleaned a rifle. Someone cursed at the generator. The radio crackled with voices from command. Another mission. Same valley. Same assurance. Simple recon. In and out. Nothing to worry about. Daniel snorted. "They always say that," he muttered, tossing his helmet onto his bunk. Ortiz laughed nervously, trying to believe it. Raines looked up from his map, eyes narrowing. "There's no such thing as simple out here." Marcus didn't respond. He just sat there, running his thumb over the edge of the photo on his chest plate. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes said more than words could. Outside, the desert wind rose, scattering dust through the open tent flap. Tomorrow will come early, and for reasons he couldn't name, Marcus watched the horizon a little longer that night, as if searching for something he couldn't see. He didn't know it yet, but the valley that waited beyond that ridge would change everything. The desert never slept. By the time the first light crept over the horizon, the camp was already awake, men moving quietly, each locked in his own thoughts, boots thudding against the dirt, gear clinking, the low hum of the helicopter engines warming up. Marcus checked his rifle one last time, the same way he always did, clean, loaded, ready. He slipped the photo of his family into the chest pocket of his vest, pressing it flat, as if sealing a promise inside his armor. He looked at his phone, with no signal, just a blank screen. For a second, he considered recording a message, something short, just in case. But he didn't. He just slipped it into his pack and whispered under his breath, "I'll call when I'm back."
The squad assembled at the helipad, the air thick with dust. Sergeant Raines briefed them over the roar of the rotors. Reconnaissance only, light contact expected, nothing major. A simple mission. They all nodded. They all wanted to believe it. As the helicopter lifted, Marcus looked out the open side door. The camp grew smaller beneath him, swallowed by the sea of sand. He thought of his mother, still asleep at home, unaware that her son was already halfway across the valley towards something waiting in the silence. They landed 20 minutes later on a plateau that looked like every other they'd seen, endless rock and heat. The wind scraped the ground, lifting small spirals of dust that clung to their boots. Marcus took point. The valley stretched below, pale sand, jagged ridges, shadows deep enough to hide anything. "We'd walked that valley a dozen times," he would later recall, but it felt too quiet this time. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. They moved single file, eyes sweeping the terrain. Ortiz lagged slightly behind, his radio antenna bobbing with each step. Daniels hummed a song under his breath, trying to fill the emptiness with sound. Raines raised his hand. They stopped. The radio crackled, static, then silence. Marcus scanned the ridge. Nothing moved. Still his stomach tightened. Instinct, the kind that came after months of surviving, the kind that whispered before danger had a name. He adjusted his grip on his rifle. Then the world split open. Gunfire erupted from the high ground, sharp, precise, echoing across the valley walls. The first rounds kicked up dust inches from their boots. Daniel shouted something no one could hear. Ortiz dropped to the ground, fumbling for cover. "Contact North Ridge," Raines yelled. "Find cover." Marcus pulled Ortiz behind a rock, grabbed his shoulder. "Breathe. You're okay. Stay with me." Ortiz's eyes were wide, his breath too fast. Marcus pressed his helmet down, steady voice cutting through the chaos. "You're fine. Listen to me. You're fine." Bullets tore through the air. The sound wasn't like in movies. It was sharper, heavier. Each one carried intent. They returned fire, short bursts, trying to pin down shadows on the ridge. The air filled with dust and the metallic sting of gunpowder. Daniels yelled for more ammo. Raines tried to call for support. The radio was dead. Then came the moment none of them forgot. Raines stood to relay hand signals. A round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him backward. He fell hard, the sound leaving everyone frozen for a heartbeat. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted through smoke and dirt, sliding beside him. "Stay down." Rains groaned, clutching his wound. Marcus wrapped his arm around the older man's chest, dragging him back behind cover. His palms came away slick with blood. Rains's voice rasped. "You're in charge now." Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. Now, Marcus, move them." That was all it took. Marcus rose halfway, firing back as he shouted orders. "Daniels, flank left. Ortiz, stay on me. We're moving east. Stay low. Move on my call." They crawled and scrambled between the rocks, trying to close distance, every movement a risk. Each time one of them shouted, "Covering!" another fired until the others moved. It became a rhythm, desperate, unspoken, drilled into their bones. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed high, burning through the haze, and the smell of gunfire hung like smoke that wouldn't clear. By late afternoon their water was gone. 2 men were wounded, one badly. They found a small depression in the ground, a shallow ditch that became their lifeline. Marcus checked ammo, 2 magazines each, barely enough. He pressed the radio to his ear again. Static. Nothing. He stared at it for a long second before dropping it in the sand. "Any word?" Daniels asked, voice cracked. Marcus shook his head. "We'll hold here until dark," he said. "Then we move." Rains was pale but awake, leaning against a rock. "You're doing good, son," he said quietly. Marcus looked out across the valley. Good's not enough. When night finally came, it came fast, swallowing the heat, replacing it with cold silence. The enemy fire slowed, then stopped. The only sound left was the wind. They tended to the wounded, tore shirts into bandages, shared the last of their water. Marcus moved among them, checking each one, forcing a calm he didn't feel. Somewhere in the darkness, a radio from the other side buzzed, distant voices, foreign, searching. Marcus motioned for silence. They froze, waiting, hearts pounding. The voices faded. When he finally sat down, the exhaustion hit him. His body ached, his ears rang, his throat was raw from shouting. He looked at the photo again, the edges frayed from being handled too often. He whispered into the darkness, just loud enough for himself to hear, "Mom, I'll be home soon." The words drifted away, carried by the wind, but deep down something inside him knew home was farther away than it had ever been. Dawn had long since burned away. By the time the sun climbed back over the ridge, Marcus and what was left of his team were ghosts in the dust, eyes hollow, lips cracked, each man clinging to a thin thread of belief that someone, somewhere, still knew they were alive. Then a flicker happened. A faint voice broke through the static of their dead radio. It was fragmented, warped by interference, but the words were there. "Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound. 1 hour." An hour. 60 minutes of holding the impossible line. Marcus looked around at his men, Rains bleeding but conscious, Daniels barely breathing, Ortiz shaking, muttering prayers under his breath. The wind carried sand like knives, slicing across their faces. The valley felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for them to fall.
He pressed the transmitter close to his lips. "This is Alpha 2-4. We copy." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that only comes when fear has already burned itself out. He looked at each of them, eyes steady, voice low. "We've come this far," he said. "We're not leaving anyone behind." And somehow that was enough. They dug in deeper, setting up what little defense they could, half-empty magazines, a few grenades, a handful of courage. Then the first wave came. The sound of gunfire returned to the valley like a storm unchained. Bullets ripped through the sandbags, through helmets, through the air thick with grit and sweat. Marcus shouted orders through the chaos. Ortiz fired blindly, trembling. Daniels kept trying to make jokes, voice fading with every word. Minutes stretched into hours. The air grew heavy, metallic, filled with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Then a crack. Ortiz froze, rifle slipping from his hands. Marcus saw it before it happened, the glint of a muzzle in the distance. He lunged forward, slamming Ortiz to the ground as rounds tore through the space they'd just stood in. Ortiz gasped, terrified. Marcus's voice was the only thing holding him to reality. "Breathe," he said. "You're all right. Keep your head down." Another blast shook the ridge. Daniel screamed. Marcus crawled toward him, dragging his limp body through the dust, ignoring the burning in his own shoulder. He pressed his hand to the wound, whispering promises neither of them could keep. You're fine, Danny. Just hold on." But the world was narrowing, his heartbeat pounding louder than the gunfire. He turned to see Rains, the man who had taught him everything, slumped against a rock, blood soaking his uniform. Their eyes met. Rains managed a faint nod, as if passing something wordless between them. Marcus gritted his teeth, fired another round, reloaded with trembling hands. His breath came ragged, his vision blurred at the edges, and still he kept going. Then the radio came alive again. "Evac choppers inbound, 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. That was all they had to survive. The men cheered weakly, hope cutting through exhaustion.
Then came the sound of a single strained cry over the gunfire. "Help! Someone's hit!" It was Ortiz. He'd been separated, pinned down behind a collapsed ridge. The evac birds were visible now, their shadows sweeping over the sand. Rains shouted, "Leave him! We're out of time!" Marcus froze, torn between duty and instinct. He looked toward the rising dust, toward the safety just a few yards away, and then back to Ortiz, a kid who'd followed every order, trusted every word. The decision wasn't logical, it wasn't tactical, it was human. He dropped his gear and ran. Every step felt heavier, slower. Bullets tore through the sand around him. His breath hitched, his body screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He reached Ortiz, dragged him by the vest, shielding him with his body as the gunfire intensified. Rains was still shouting something about orders, extraction, surviving, but Marcus couldn't hear him anymore. The world had faded into a low hum, his focus narrowing to the sound of Ortiz's heartbeat against his chest. He looked back, once, just once, at the others running toward the choppers, then turned again toward the ridge, and that's when the world went white. A sound so deep it felt like silence itself swallowed everything. The explosion lifted the ground, flung dust, metal, and memory into the sky. Then nothing. When the reinforcements finally landed, the valley was unrecognizable. Torn earth, shattered rock, rifles half buried in sand. The medics moved fast, voices clipped and tired. 3 survivors, one said. 2 critical. Another voice quieter. "Any sign of Marcus Hale?" A pause. Then the answer no one wanted. "Negative. We got everyone except Marcus Hale." The report would later call it heroic action under hostile fire. But for the men who were there, those words meant little, because in the silence that followed, when the gunfire faded and the engines lifted them out of the valley, every man left behind a part of himself right there beside Marcus. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a porch light was still burning. The valley fell silent. Days later, when the dust settled and the reports were filed, the name Marcus Hale appeared at the bottom of a list no soldier ever wants to see. Missing, presumed KIA. Back at the base, the flag flew at half-mast. The air felt heavier, as if the ground itself remembered. The surviving members of the unit moved slower, spoke less. Laughter had become a stranger there. Ortiz sat alone at a metal desk, bandaged and shaking, staring at a blank sheet of paper. His hand trembled as he began to write. "Mrs. Hale, I don't really know how to start this. Marcus saved us all that day. He kept me calm when I couldn't breathe. He carried me when I couldn't move, and he went back when he didn't have to. He wasn't just our leader, he was the reason any of us came home." He stopped, looked out at the endless desert horizon still streaked with smoke. "I thought you should know he never stopped talking about you. Every night before a mission he'd call home, said your voice kept him steady, said as long as you answered, he'd find his way back." The ink bled slightly where a tear hit the page. Ortiz folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in the outgoing mail pile. For him, that letter was the only thing he could do, the only way to make sense of what they had lost. The base carried on as bases always do. Another mission, another rotation, another sunset that looked too beautiful for the things it had seen. But for those who had known Marcus, something invisible remained. The silence between conversations, the empty bunk at the end of the row, the photo still taped to the wall. Marcus, smiling, alive. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet house lined with framed memories, a phone began to ring. Mrs. Hale reached for it slowly, expecting it to be her sister, or the church, or maybe one of the neighbors who always called to check on her when her son was away. But the voice on the other end wasn't familiar. It was calm, practiced, and heavy. "Ma'am, this is Captain Reynolds. I'm calling about your son." She didn't need to hear the rest. Something inside her had known since that night, since the line went dead, and she kept listening anyway. The words blurred together. Mission, ambush, heroism, no remains recovered. Her eyes stayed on the porch light glowing through the window, the one she'd left on every night since he'd called. She didn't cry first. She just sat there, phone in hand, still listening, as though Marcus might break through the static again and say something, anything. Then she pressed a button and replayed the last voicemail. "Mom, it's me. I just wanted to hear your voice. I'll be home soon." His voice filled the room, small and fragile, but alive. And then the silence that followed, the same silence that had haunted her ever since. Weeks passed. The letter from Ortiz arrived, folded neatly inside a government envelope. She read it once, twice, then placed it beside the photo on the mantel.
In the following months, the men who survived began to return, some to their families, some to their own ghosts. They met again one final time, Rains, Ortiz, Daniel's younger brother, standing before a wall of names etched in metal. Each letter, each name carved in stillness. Rains stepped forward and placed a pair of worn dog tags at the base of the wall. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Rains said quietly, "He never left us. He just stayed where he was needed most." The others nodded. There wasn't much left to say. He wasn't just a soldier. He was their anchor in the storm, the calm in the chaos, the voice that reminded them why they fought. Some men returned home in body, some in memory, and some, like Marcus Hale, remained forever on that invisible line between both, present in every life he touched, every story retold. Back at Mrs. Hale's house, night again, the same porch light still burns softly. She sits beside the phone, the same one that once carried his voice through the static. Her eyes are tired but gentle, her hand resting on the folded letter. The radio hums
faintly, static, then quiet. She looks toward it, almost expecting to hear him again, and softly, almost to herself, she whispers, "I heard you, baby." The light flickers once, then steadies, a small, unwavering glow against the dark. Some calls never get returned, some promises never fade, and somewhere, far beyond the noise of war, a mother's voice still answers, so that her son, wherever he is, never feels alone. If this story reached you, if, for even a moment, you saw yourself in Marcus or in the mother who waited for his call, then take a moment right now to leave a light for him. Write his name in the comments below, not as a goodbye, but as a reminder that some voices, once heard, never really fade. Because every story like this, every soldier, every family, every call that ends too soon deserves to be remembered. Would you have done the same in his place? Would you have turned back, knowing what waited on that ridge? There's no right answer, only the truth of what it means to care for something or someone more than yourself. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Every week we bring you stories of courage, of loss, of the unseen moments behind the uniform. Stories that remind us that even in the darkest hours, there is still light, and it lives on in the voices we refuse to forget.